reminder that beginning last week, we now have the opportunity to record this and upload it onto the YouTube channel of the church, which is a great gift to Amber and I, who do the principal amount of teaching, because often people will say, oh gosh, we tried to get there and we couldn't. Wish we could hear the class, and we'll see if people will take advantage of that. But for better or worse, we now have that, and grateful to our fellow learner, Jim Gerardu, who is recording this for us. Anyway, a quick recap, because not everybody is always here, and as you know, we try to kind of make things stand alone. But today we're going to be looking at the second part of a series, and so to do a little bit of a recap, this two-part series, the doctor is in, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and the reason why I say the doctor is in, it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, is that Ambrose would be designated as one of the 4 doctors of the church by the Catholic Church 1,000 years ago. In other words, some of the most significant early leaders of the church. Ambrose was one of those. Augustine, who we'll touch on today, Jerome, all contemporaries of each other, and then Gregory, Bishop Gregory, who gave us Gregorian chant. So those were the 4 doctors of the early church, which tells us something about their significance. I mentioned to you that the 4th century in which Ambrose lived was a highly consequential one for the church. It was a time of an incredible amount of church leadership, all of whom we have either studied in this class or will yet study. People like Athanasius in Alexandria, who was one of the great warriors against the heresy of Arianism, this heresy that decreed that Christ was somehow less than God the Father because he had taken on our humanity. And so that was combated by Athanasius and so many others, including our friend Ambrose, as you'll see. Basil, who was a bishop in Cappadocia and central Turkey as we know it today, who also carried on that fight. And then contemporary, as I mentioned before, with Jerome, who will be one of the great Bible translators. We'll actually talk about Jerome last week. And today we'll touch on a little bit the influence that Ambrose had upon Augustine, who, for my money, is probably one of the greatest Christian leaders that ever lived at any and all times, hands down. One of those kind of top 3 people that I want to meet in heaven. I've got a kind of a list that's building up, as many of you know. Part of that context that I wanted you to be aware of is that what had preceded Bishop Ambrose by just a few decades was the wholesale persecution of the church. So even though, as Ambrose leads forward, Christianity is literally exploding in popularity and spreading throughout the empire itself is becoming Christianized. The leadership of the empire has become Christian for the most part, but only a few years before the time of Ambrose, the time of persecution. So this is very much part of his framing as well of what the church has endured. And perhaps this is what gives him some of his zeal and his great appreciation to find the church now at a place of peace and prosperity. 2 important events that I mentioned last week that also helped lead us into where Ambrose has come from. Just a decade or so before he was born, the famous Edict of Milan, which is when Emperor Constantine first granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. In other words, put an end to persecution, but beyond that, that worship is something that is tolerated. Whatever you choose, we now live in an empire that values religious freedom. And then the second significant event, again, just a decade before the birth of our Ambrose, was the Council of Nicaea that met up near Constantinople. And that famous council, which was convened by Emperor Constantine, he's kind of the constant in both of those, that church council is the one that was meant to put the final period upon this controversy and debate about the very nature of who Christ is. combating that heresy of Arianism. And so out of the Council of Nicaea would be born one of the great ecumenical creeds of the church, the Nicene Creed, which we still use in worship today. The Nicene Creed that asserts emphatically that Christ is God of God, very God of very God, begotten, not made, of one with the Father. And so this affirmation of the high Christology that would characterize the church. I also wanted you to be aware of the political landscape that Ambrose found himself in, because also just prior to maybe a couple of decades before him, the empire had been divided basically into 4 parts. This was an attempt on the part of the emperors to somehow rule more effectively in what was now a vast empire that stretched from Spain all the way to Iran. And how to do that, they thought you couldn't do this from just one place. We need to divide this empire up. And so 4 leaders would be chosen to help guide that process. So in some ways, this was a good thing, but what developed practically, because, oh well, human nature, is that often these rulers would rival with each other. They'd overlap each other, saying, well, yeah, I know Jim was ruler with me, but really I'm kind of more important than Jim is, and so I'm going to kind of move it. And so all of this is part of this reality of Ambrose, which leads us into this current situation. As I mentioned to you, Ambrose would be bishop over the time of 3 emperors, Gratian, Valentinian II, and Theodosius. Gratian and Valentinian were actually half-brothers with each other. Theodosius was one of those tetrarchal rulers, and so we're going to come back to them, but this is also part of our friend Ambrose. So part 2 I've entitled Sing a New Song, because as we'll see in just a few minutes, Ambrose, in addition to all of the things on his plate as someone guiding the empire's policy about religion, someone who is preaching and writing, was also a composer, and we're going to sing some of the words of Ambrose in just a little bit. But a reminder of Ambrose when he lived, as I said, throughout most of this 4th century. He was bishop for 23 of those, and as I mentioned to you, as was often the case at this time, he was a reluctant bishop. He did not intend to be a leader of the church. He had actually been trained as a governor, and at the time that he was kind of co-opted into becoming bishop of this important city of Milan, he was actually the governor of that region and had been drawn into political dissent in the church because an old bishop had died, Auxentius, who had Arian leanings. And our governor / soon to become bishop had stepped in to make sure that there was a peaceful election, but also hoping and kind of pushing toward not a replacement of an Arian bishop, but of an Orthodox bishop, one that followed the Creed of Nicaea. So this is the world that our friend Ambrose inhabited 1700 years ago. One of the things to be aware of is the extent to which Ambrose, as was the case of many of church leaders at this time, were often forced to speak truth to power. And they could do that reluctantly, they could do that boldly. But Ambrose was someone who felt that he had a moral voice, he had a theological voice that had to be exercised in difficult circumstances. And what I share with you here a little bit is an excerpt to the second of those emperors that you saw on the list, Emperor Valentinian II, in opposition to the restoration of a pagan altar that had stood in the Roman Senate. And during the preceding emperor's reign, Gratian, Valentinian's half-brother, that pagan altar to victory, this kind of anonymous, pagan offering so that all of the gods of ancient Rome could be appeased, was removed, but there was a constant movement to reinstate it, to bring it back into the Roman Senate. And so our friend Ambrose steps up to the plate. he writes to the emperor, and these are, some of the excerpts from that. As all men who live under the Roman sway engage in military service under you, the emperors and princes of the world, so too do you yourselves owe service to Almighty God and our holy faith. In other words, here's where your allegiance falls. For salvation is not sure unless everyone worship in truth the true God, that is the God of the Christians, under whose sway are all things, for he alone is the true God. Since then, most Christian emperor, there is due from you to the true God both faith and zeal, care and devotion for the faith. I wonder how the hope has risen up in some that you would feel it a duty to restore by your command altars to the gods of the heathen and furnish the funds requisite for profane sacrifices. This is pretty bold of him to speak to the emperor. And they are complaining, in other words, the pagans are complaining of their losses, who never spared our blood. There's a reference to the persecution, who destroyed the very buildings of the churches. I, as a priest of Christ, call upon your faith. All of us bishops would have joined in calling upon you. In other words, you would have got together a contingent. Were not the report so sudden and incredible that any such thing had been either suggested in your council or petitioned for by the Senate. But far be it from the Senate to have petitioned this. A few heathen are making use of the common name. In other words, it comes under supposedly the guise of the Senate, but basically he's saying there are not many pagans left in the synod. Well, a little bit of that voice of Ambrose to Valentinian, and not surprisingly, he was successful. He forestalled the resurrection of this altar in the pagan, or in the Senate of Rome. One of the most significant stories in the life of Ambrose, and particularly one germane to his speaking truth to power, occurred during the reign of that third Roman emperor under whom he served, Emperor Theodosius. There had been an awful event in the life of Theodosius as ruler, where it had come to his attention that the people of Thessaloniki, in other words, the same place where Paul had written to the Thessalonians, there had been an uprising there, and during that uprising, one of the Roman leaders had been killed. This infuriated Theodosius. He ordered punishment upon the people of Thessalonica. And before he could think about this, and in fact, Ambrose even intervened to say, don't do anything rash. That order could not be rescinded, and a terrible event occurred in Thessaloniki, where the Romans gathered in, opened the circus, the place where the horses, ran for the most part, said, come to free games at the circus. And after the people of Thessaloniki had gathered in that arena, they locked the gates, and the Roman soldiers massacred 7,000 people, men, women, and children. Well, our friend, our emperor, regretted this mightily because he had tried to stop his order. It was too late. But Ambrose, as the moral leader of Milan, now has to say, once again, some hard words to Theodosius. And this comes from the letter that he writes to him. Listen, august emperor, which in itself is a little bit kind of butsy. Listen to me. I cannot deny that you have a zeal for the faith. He starts out by, I say nice things first, kind of build him up. I do confess that you have the fear of God, but you have a natural vehemence, in other words, passion, which if anyone endeavors to soothe, you quickly turn to mercy. If anyone stirs it up, you rouse it so much more than you can scarcely restrain it. In other words, it works two ways. Somebody can rouse it quickly, somebody can calm it down. There was that done in the city of the Thessalonians, of which no similar record exists, which I was not able to prevent happening, which indeed I had before said would be most atrocious when I so often petitioned against it, and that which you yourself show by revoking it too late. You consider to be grave. This I could not extenuate when done. When it was first heard of, this massacre, a synod had met because of the arrival of the bishops from Gaul. There was not one who did not lament it, not one who thought lightly of it. I urge, I beg, I exhort, I warn, for it is a grief to me that you who were an example of unusual piety, who were conspicuous for clemency, who would not suffer single offenders to be put in peril, should not mourn that so many have perished, 7,000. I dare, and that then he gets to where the rubber meets the road. As the head of the church, I cannot offer the sacrifice if you intend to be present. In other words, the very communion that we will celebrate today, if you show up in church, I will not officiate at communion. Is that which is not allowed after shedding the blood of one, in other words, a murderer cannot come to communion, of one innocent person allowed after shedding the blood of many? I do not think so. And basically what he calls upon Theodosius is penance is required. And the implication is public penance. If you lament of this, then you need to make it clear. And one of the famous kind of episodes in the life of both Theodosius is Ambrose is pretty much well documented, that Theodosius literally comes to the door of the cathedral. This is a painting, by the way, by Peter Paul Rubens, strips himself of his royal regalia and falls down in front of Ambrose. The emperor, the Roman emperor, falls down to receive absolution from Ambrose. So it is a significant event in the life of Ambrose. And as I said, it's just one example of this great Christian leader of the 4th century speaking truth to power in a difficult time. Well, I mentioned to you, or I entitled this part 2 of Ambrose, Sing a New Song unto the Lord. Because one of the things that is not widely spoken of by Ambrose, but it is a significant one, is that Ambrose was a great writer of text to be sung. I came across this incredible mosaic that you're looking at here, which actually is in Oxford. In fact, it actually says this here. This is part of the floor of Worcester College Chapel, Oxford, 1791. It is Ambrose. And in front of him, you see on this page the beginning of the words Te Deum. St. Ambrose was traditionally credited with composing the Te Deum, which he is said to have composed when he baptized St. Augustine of Hippo, his most celebrated convert. We'll touch on that at the end. So the Te Deum, for those of you who are not choral singers, is one of the standard texts in the church, of which if you've been in choirs of any size for any length of time, you're likely to have sung a Te Deum. Rudder composed one. Mark and I grew up in our churches, the big churches that we attended, singing one by Sanford. We praise thee, O God, we acknowledge him to be the Lord. There is a whole text that is basically the whole kind of theology of the Bible in a Te Deum. It's often sung at coronations, at big events in the life of the church. I don't know if have we done a Te Deum here since you've been here? Have we done a Te Deum? We're likely at some point in time, but this standard piece of music writing, I should say the words, because we don't have the music, which no doubt Ambrose composed, but the words of it have been around for 1,700 years. They're still in the choral repertoire. And we owe that to our friend Ambrose 1,700 years ago. But Ambrose was first and foremost a writer of hymns for the church. This I love, some of you know that I'm newly into AI, asking AI to kind of imagine something for me. And you can be very specific, telling AI, in fact, I asked them, please imagine for me what it looked like for Bishop Ambrose in the 4th century to write music. And that's exactly what AI gave me. I love that about AI. But this wonderful quote, in 386, the hymn as we know it was born. The hymn as we know it was born, not at a scholar's desk or in a choir loft, but in a besieged church. And the reference that Titus Cantrell makes here is to another event in the confrontation with power that Ambrose was, often, involved in. And this involved the Empress Justina. Justina was the mother of Valentinian, the stepmom of Gratian. So she was no longer empress. It was her husband that had been emperor, but she still held incredible power. And spoiler alert, she was an Arian. And so she and Ambrose were always at odds. She was always trying to advance the cause of Arianism, and at one point had petitioned her son, the emperor, who gave kind of a passive, yeah, go ahead. She said, I want one of the basilicas in the city of Milan that can be an Arian basilica. And her son said, well, okay, if you want to, go ahead and do that. Well, Ambrose said, that ain't gonna happen. And at one point, according to the story that is pretty well documented, Justina literally marched on the Cathedral of Milan with the Roman soldiers to take it over. And as the story goes, the soldiers never went in to take it because they were undone by the fact that there was this loud outpouring of singing in the church. The congregation had gathered in support of Ambrose, and they were singing. And so it is with that in mind that I thought it would be very appropriate for us to sing the words of Ambrose. We got enough choir people here. Do not be undone by that, but pick up a hymn. The Vogelzangs are going to help us with that. Turn to page 14. Kevin is gonna play. We're so grateful for the Vogelzangs to be here with us, who are themselves choral leaders and professional musicians. And we're gonna start by singing the words from what I think from many of you, page 14. Hymn 14, Savior of the Nations Come. Note in that the little kind of small print at the top attributed to Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, you're singing words that are 1700 years old, but under that, paraphrased by Martin Luther. It was Luther who kind of rediscovered this legacy, put it into German, and from that it has now come down literally into the hymnals in our sanctuary. I'm turning it over to you, my dear. Sound familiar to many of you?
Ready?
Coming out to those Roman soldiers, I wouldn't be breaking into that sanctuary either. Okay, the other Ambrose song, and he composed dozens, by the way, but the other one that has made it forward into our songbooks is 474. 474, O splendor of God's glory bright. And even if it's not overly familiar, you may recognize the tune. And again, some of the small print there, for those of you who are choral people, it was adapted by Michael Pretorius, who was one of the great composers of the Renaissance. And so here we will sing these words, 1700 years old, of our friend Bishop Ambrose. Does anybody recognize that last tune?
It's a Christmas carol.
It's a, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know. I find that rather profound to be singing words that were composed 1700 years ago. And as I said, it fell upon the ears of these Roman soldiers who's, again, according to the story that goes with that, they ain't going in there. And that stalled off yet another encounter as one of the tasks of the Bishop Ambrose, working out of this imperial city of Milan. You kind of may wonder where Rome was at this time. Next week when we're together, I'm going to pick up a little bit of the story of Jerome, and particularly Jerome and the translation of the Bible into Latin. And then Amber is going to pick up with a more in-depth story about Jerome. So Jerome's connection was in Rome. Rome was still one of the heartbeat cities of the church, but Milan had grown in influence because it was the seat of imperial power at this point in time. So hence this connection with this northern city. Well, one little kind of a side story related to some of the things that we've already talked about, which is kind of along the lines of, when Joseph confronts of Exodus, confronts his brothers. He says, as for you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Where God used a pagan leader to do something incredible for the church. Well, let me back up. Who you're looking at here is one of the Roman senators whose name was Symmachus. And he's often referred to as one of the last pagan senators because most of the Senate was Christian at this time. But Symmachus was a very powerful voice for the old ways. And in fact, that whole episode of the appeal to the emperor to reinstate the altar of victory had been pushed by Symmachus. Now, what was behind Symmachus's zeal in this was this fear that in alienating the old Roman gods, the Roman Empire would be at risk. Because weren't these the gods that had brought us to victory over the years? So that was his argument behind the reinstitution of these old pagan ways. So Symmachus, as you can see, had a pretty great legacy. He was governor of proconsular Africa. North Africa was a very powerful province, big provincial area for Rome. It's where it was kind of like the grain, the grain basket, the bread basket for Rome was North Africa. He became then urban prefect of Rome itself. And at the time that we're talking about him, he was literally consul of Rome. In other words, he was the top dog in Rome. So a man of great influence. So he's the one appealing to the emperor. Here, we need to get these pagan things back on. So as you can see here, he protested to Emperor Gratian, that first emperor, about the removal of the altar from the Senate, and then appealed to Gratian's half-brother Valentinian to return the altar of victory. But here's the kicker where you can't make this up. It was this pagan emperor who appointed Augustine, the great theologian of the church. It was him who appointed Augustine as a professor of rhetoric to the imperial court in Milan in 384. So in other words, it was this pagan emperor who was responsible for summoning the great Augustine onto the scene, someone who, as I said, would become one of the most influential leaders of the church. Now, after the first of the year, Amber and I are at long last going to do an in-depth dive into St. Augustine, who arguably, as I said, one of the great leaders of the church anytime and all time. He's also, as I said, top of my list, one of the first people to meet in heaven. But Augustine, when he came to Rome and then eventually to Milan, summoned there to teach rhetoric, Augustine had a very religious mother. Her name was Monica. She was very concerned about her son Augustine because Augustine was raised in a Christian home, but he had succumbed to one of the other compelling heresies of the day, what was called Manichaeism. And Manichaeism was kind of a synchronistic religion that kind of coupled Christianity with Far Eastern religion, but it was a dualistic faith that decreed kind of a dualism between the spiritual world and the physical world. Spiritual world and the physical world. Spiritual world good, physical world bad. So in other words, this is not what the Bible teaches us. We are told that God created everything and pronounced it good. We do not denigrate our physical body. This was also given to us by God. And where Manichaeism really began to go off the rails is they basically denied the legitimacy of the entire Old Testament. Because, well, for Pete's sakes, that's where creation is. So this great God can't have created this evil physical matter. And that all of those stories of people fighting and wars, that's not what we're about. We're about this ethereal spiritual life. So that was a little bit of his background. That was of great concern to Monica, who was constantly appealing and praying on his behalf. Well, as God would have it, Symmachus summoned from North Africa this enormously talented, well-trained teacher of rhetoric, of public speaking and public logic, kind of like a lawyer without a court, we might say, to come to the imperial court. And it was there that Augustine was brought into the sway of Ambrose himself. Ambrose would end up baptizing him, which is what you see here, and you would find Augustine finally himself ordained. Here you see him preaching, his mother Monica down below, and Ambrose, his mentor, who we see here. Now, Ambrose doesn't tell us anything about these encounters with Augustine, but Augustine does in his great spiritual biography entitled The Confessions. And I'm just going to read you a few excerpts because you get a little bit of an insight into this encounter between Ambrose and Augustine. And this is what Augustine writes: "To Milan I came, to Ambrose the bishop, whose eloquent discourse did then plentifully dispense unto thy people," he's writing this to God, to Christ, by the way, "the flour of thy wheat, the gladness of thy oil, and the sober inebriation of thy wine. To him," to Ambrose, "was I unknowingly led by thee, that by him I might knowingly be led to thee. That man of God received me as a father, showed me his kindness on my coming. Thenceforth I began to love him, and I listened diligently to him, preaching to the people, not with the intent I ought, but as it were, trying his eloquence. Remember, he's himself a teacher of rhetoric. So he's fascinated by Ambrose because he's such a good speaker. Anyway, so I listened to him, not with the intent I ought, but as it were, trying his eloquence, whether it answered of the fame, or flowed fuller or lower than was reported. And I hung on his words attentively, but of the matter, the content, I was a careless and scornful onlooker. So he's describing this process. He goes to hear, oh, this most eloquent speaker, that's my job. And while I opened my heart to admit how eloquently he spoke, there also entered how truly he spoke. So eventually the truth began to make its way in. He goes on to say, my mother had now come to me, resolute through piety, following me over sea and land, in all perils confiding in thee. She found me in a grievous peril, though despaired of ever finding the truth. So she's aware of this battle that he's going for. But when I discovered to her that I was no longer a Manichae, a follower of this heresy, though not yet fully a Catholic Christian, she was not overjoyed as at something unexpected. So she's kind of holding out. And so he says, and she was known for her prayers, but to thee, fountain of mercies, poured forth she more copious prayer and tears than thou wouldst hasten thy help and enlighten my darkness. And she listened the more eagerly to the church. She hung on the words of Ambrose, praying for the fountain of that water which springeth up into life everlasting. But that man she loved as an angel, because she knew that by him I had been brought for the present to this somewhat doubtful state of faith. Well, I want to read you one last thing that he writes about Ambrose, and it's kind of germane to what we have just done. So by now he has been baptized. By now he has been fully into the presence of God, and he says this. He said about worship, very appropriate to what we're about to do. How did I weep in thy hymns and canticles, these very things that we sung, touched to the quick by the voices of thy sweet attuned church. He's mesmerized by this singing. The voices flowed into my ears, and the truth distilled into my heart, whence the affections of my devotion overflowed, and tears ran down, and happy was I therein. In worship, the hymns make him cry. How often does that happen to us? A word. So that's our dear Augustine speaking about the impact of this man Ambrose and of congregational singing. So maybe as you go forward today into worship, as we sing together, think of this birth of congregational singing, its significance, and how often, remember what one of the great quotes of Luther is, that he who sings prays twice. You know, the impact of singing, not just upon us, but of those who hear it. So go forward in that. So friends, we'll wrap up here for today. Next week, I'll have one final session with you, which is to go into one of the contemporaries of our friend Ambrose, 15 years his junior, who was this soon-to-be priest Jerome. Jerome, who would become one of the great translators of the Bible into the language of the people, what was called the vulgar language, in other words, the common language of the people, aka Latin. And that Latin Vulgate Bible was so significant. It was the first time the entire Bible would be translated from the original Hebrew and the original Greek into the language of the people. We take that for granted now, but it was Jerome who began that process. By the way, I came across this image when I was in Ireland just a few months ago, and we were at the National Museum. I'm pointing to Jane Bruno, she was there, and Mark and some of us on this wonderful trip to Ireland, and came across this painting of of Saint Jerome here in that process of translating the Bible. So that's what we'll look at next week as we continue this deep dive into this rich period that we're looking at. So friends, we wrap up there for today. Encourage you to go across the street. We have an international coffee hour as I understand, that is probably ready. I'm looking at my husband. He's
Decorated the table.
Mark decorated the table. We have on good. I know that there's cookies there because Jane was bringing them, and if Jane brings cookies, the cookies are there. But if you get there early, even in the rain, there is a new show that has been hung in the gallery, which is of international global textiles in celebration of communion, or World Communion Day that launches today, and it comes from the collection of Mark and Marilyn Bohr. So our house has been denuded and our church has been enriched by these beautiful textiles. So I commend that to you, and on a personal note, I would welcome your prayers for worship today because I am your preaching pastor. So there's a lot on my plate today, and I'm looking forward to sharing thank you, Mo, stories of the global church about food and faith and fellowship. So go in his peace.